The mistake at the airport. Grace Patterson's sneakers squeaked against the polished hospital floor, the sound lost beneath the endless beeps of monitors and the low hum of fluorescent lights. She had been running for 14 hours straight, and still there was no sign of rest. Her royal blue scrubs clung to her frame, wrinkled from constant movement. Her curly hair was tied back tightly, though strands kept falling loose against her forehead. Sweat marked her temples, yet her brown eyes stayed sharp. She was the kind of nurse who refused to give anything less than her all. Northwestern Memorial Hospital had been her second home for the past 8 years. She had walked its endless halls through storms, through holidays missed, through birthdays forgotten. Grace was 29, but sometimes she felt 50. Grace, room 314 needs meds, and Mrs. Henderson is calling for you again. Nurse Patricia called from the desk, her voice carrying exhaustion and familiarity. Grace gave a quick nod, her lips forming a tired smile. "On it," she said, her voice quiet but steady. She moved, quickly, her hands steady as she checked vitals, offered comfort, adjusted pillows, answered questions she had learned to live on instinct. Her heart guided her actions more than her brain, and patients trusted her because she always made time to listen, even when the clock said she had none. Mrs. Henderson, a frail woman in her late 70s, reached for her hand. "You remind me of my daughter," she whispered, her voice trembling with age. "Always rushing, but always kind." Grace squeezed her hand gently. "Rest now. I'll be back soon," she promised. By the time the shift finally ended, the city outside was cloaked in darkness. Snowflakes danced against the window, reminding Grace that Chicago winters cared little for the lives rushing beneath them. She walked to the locker room, changed into jeans and a warm sweater, and grabbed her old duffel bag. Today was supposed to be different. Today she was not only a nurse but also a guest speaker at a small medical conference in New York. She had been invited to share her experience on frontline resilience during crisis. It was an honor she had never expected. Her mother had cried on the phone when she told her, "Gracie, this is God opening doors. Don't you miss this chance?" her mother had said. But as usual, Grace was late. She had stayed longer at the hospital because a young patient had needed her. How could she say no when a frightened child asked her to stay until the medicine worked? Now, rushing through Chicago O'Hare Airport, duffel bag on her shoulder, she felt the weight of time pressing against her chest. The departure board glowed overhead. Flight to New York. Final boarding. Her heart raced. She pushed through the crowd, her ticket clenched in her hand, but as she reached the gate, she saw a staff member holding up a sign with her name. "Mrs. Patterson." "Yes, that's me." Grace gasped, breathless. "This way, please," the staff member said politely, guiding her through a quiet side hallway instead of the crowded main line. She blinked, confused, but had no time to question. Within minutes, she was outside on the tarmac, the winter wind biting against her cheeks. A sleek private jet waited with its steps lowered, its polished body gleaming beneath floodlights. This is for the medical conference?" she asked hesitantly. The staff member only smiled. "Yes, hurry, they're waiting." Her heart pounded as she climbed the steps, the warmth of the cabin wrapping around her. The air smelled of leather and faint cologne, nothing like the recycled air of commercial flights. A man sat across the aisle, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a tailored suit. His watch gleamed as he glanced up. His eyes, piercing blue and far too calm, landed on her. "You must be the new assistant," he said smoothly, his voice deep, controlled, used to being obeyed. Grace froze, confusion washing over her. "Assistant?" She opened her mouth to explain, but the engines roared to life. The door sealed and the ground beneath them disappeared as the jet lifted into the night sky. Her stomach twisted, panic fluttered in her chest. She looked at the ticket still clutched in her hand and for the first time realized the paper was not hers. Her flight was commercial, Gate 24B, not this private jet soaring toward the unknown. Her eyes widened as the man leaned back casually, studying her. "You look younger than I expected, but I believe in giving people chances. Let's hope you're capable." Grace swallowed hard, the city lights shrinking beneath them. Snow clouds, swallowing Chicago, And in that moment she knew she was not on her way to New York. She was trapped on a billionaire's jet, headed to somewhere she had never planned to go. Section 2. Exhaustion meets destiny. Grace's mind spun, her thoughts colliding like waves in a storm. She tried to steady her breathing, reminding herself she had handled emergencies far worse than this. She had faced death, pain, fear. Yet somehow this mistake felt heavier than any shift she had survived. The man across from her opened a tablet, scrolling with quick precision. Every movement efficient, his tailored suit crisp, his shoes polished to perfection. Everything about him screamed control, wealth, and power. Grace felt out of place in her sweater and jeans, her sneakers still damp from snow, her duffel bag slumped at her feet. Finally, she gathered courage. "Excuse me, sir, I think there's been a mistake." Her voice trembled but remained steady enough. He glanced up, one brow raised. "A mistake?" "Yes, I was supposed to be on a medical flight to New York for a conference," she said quickly, clutching the duffel strap like it might anchor her. His eyes narrowed, a flicker of surprise breaking through his calm mask. Then he chuckled, low and almost amused. "You're telling me you boarded my jet by accident?" Her cheeks heated. "Yes, that's exactly what happened." Silence stretched, broken only by the hum of engines. Finally, he leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Well, Ms. Patterson, is it? Fate has an odd sense of humor, because we're not going to New York, we're going to Barbados." Her breath caught Barbados, a place she had only seen in pictures. Beaches like paradise, skies like paintings. Yet here she was, a nurse with an overdrawn bank account, suddenly airborne toward it with a stranger. The man extended his hand slightly. "Ethan Hawthorne," he said simply. The name rang faint bells. She remembered hearing it on the news. Billionaire investor, philanthropist, CEO of Hawthorne Global. Grace stared, stunned, then slowly shook his hand. His grip was firm, steady, commanding. "So, nurse or assistant, whichever you are," Ethan said with a faint smirk. "For the next 3 days it seems you're coming with me." Her heart raced, the reality hitting hard. She was heading to the Caribbean, trapped in a billionaire's world, and nothing about her ordinary life would ever be the same again. The flight into the unknown. Grace sat stiffly in her leather seat as the jet cut through the night sky, the hum of the engines blending with the pressure in her chest. She could hardly believe what had just happened. Hours earlier, she was standing in the fluorescent-lit hallways of the hospital, where exhaustion was as familiar to her as breathing. Now she was thousands of feet above the ground, riding in a private jet that belonged to one of the most powerful men in the country. Everything about the situation felt unreal, like she had walked straight into someone else's life. She kept telling herself this was just a mistake, an accident that could be corrected once they landed, but a small, nervous voice in her mind whispered that nothing about this was going to be simple. Ethan Hawthorne hadn't spoken much since she admitted the mistake. He had gone back to his tablet, scrolling through numbers and emails with calm detachment, as if being stuck on a plane with a stranger who didn't belong there was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Grace watched him cautiously, studying the sharp lines of his face, the way his jaw flexed when he concentrated, and the way his eyes flicked across the screen with razor focus. He radiated authority without even trying, and it made her feel even more out of place. She was just a nurse from Chicago who barely managed to pay her rent every month, and he was a billionaire used to commanding boardrooms and building empires. The longer she sat in silence, the more her mind spun. What if they discovered she wasn't supposed to be here? Would she be arrested when they landed? Would he throw her out the moment they touched the ground? Her heart pounded as she thought of her mother waiting for her call after the conference, of her colleagues who had encouraged her to attend, of the patients who had smiled when she told them she was finally doing something for herself. Everything had been leading to that one opportunity, and now it was gone because of a boarding mistake. The thought made her chest tighten with a familiar ache. Life had a way of pulling the rug from under her just when she thought she was finally moving forward. But there was also something else, something she didn't want to admit. Despite the panic, despite the loss, despite the unknown, There was a small spark inside her, a flicker of wonder. She had never flown on a private jet, never been treated like someone important enough to skip lines and be escorted directly to the runway. The cabin smelled of expensive leather and polished wood, and the seats reclined into beds with the push of a button. Even the blanket folded neatly beside her looked softer than anything she had ever owned. For the first time in years, she wasn't surrounded by beeping monitors, crying families, or endless paperwork. For the first time, the world was quiet. And though she hated herself for it, a part of her wanted to lean back, close her eyes, and let herself enjoy the silence. Ethan broke the silence at last. "So, Grace Patterson, nurse at Northwestern Memorial," he said without looking up. She froze, unsure how he knew that. "I checked your name as soon as you said it. My assistant is still at the airport wondering why I left without her. It seems the staff made a mix-up." He finally set down his tablet and studied her with eyes that seemed to see straight through her. "The question is, what am I supposed to do with you now?" Grace swallowed hard. I don't want to cause trouble. If you can have me put on the next flight back to Chicago or New York, I'll pay for it myself. I just need to get to the conference." He raised one eyebrow, the hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "You think it's that simple? We're already over the Atlantic. By the time we land in Barbados, you will have missed your conference. You're not going." Back tonight, her stomach dropped. The conference had been her one chance to prove herself outside the hospital walls, to show that her years of service and sacrifice meant something more than just overtime hours. Now it was gone, and she had no way of fixing it. She felt tears sting at the back of her eyes but forced them down. She had cried enough in her life, and she refused to let this man see her break. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, her voice steady even as her throat tightened. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I'll figure something out when we land." Ethan leaned back in his seat watching her. There was something unreadable in his expression, a mixture of amusement and curiosity, as though he were deciding whether to dismiss her or entertain the oddness of the situation. "You intrigue me," he said finally. "Most people would be begging, apologizing, or panicking. You sit there and tell me you'll figure it out. Do you always face disasters so calmly?" Grace almost laughed, though the sound came out sharp and tired. "When you've worked in an emergency ward long enough, you learn to keep calm even when the world is falling apart. Panic doesn't save lives." For the first time, Ethan's expression softened, just slightly. He regarded her with a new kind of interest, the kind that suggested he was beginning to see her as more than just a mistake. "Interesting," he murmured almost to himself before reaching for a glass of water and sipping it slowly. The rest of the flight passed in a strange haze. The attendant served food so elegantly plated it looked like something from a magazine, though Grace barely touched it. She kept thinking about her mother's voice, about the disappointment waiting for her when she had to explain she missed the conference because of a mistake too unbelievable to be real. Yet underneath the disappointment was another feeling, one that grew stronger the closer they flew toward the islands. Curiosity. She had no idea what awaited her in Barbados, no idea what Ethan Hawthorne expected from her, but she felt something shifting, something she couldn't name. When the jet finally began its descent hours later, the window shades were lifted, and Grace's breath caught in her throat. The ocean stretched below, endless and brilliant, the water glowing with shades of turquoise and sapphire she had never seen before. White sand curved along the shoreline like ribbon, and palm trees swayed gently in the breeze. It was paradise, pure and unfiltered, so far from the gray snow-covered streets of Chicago that it felt like another planet. For a moment her worries faded, replaced by awe. Ethan glanced at her and caught the look on her face. For the first time he smiled. Not the smirk of a billionaire used to getting his way, but a genuine, almost boyish smile. "Welcome to Barbados," he said, his voice lighter than before. "Let's see what fate has in store for us." Grace pressed her hands together tightly in her lap as the plane touched down, her heart racing faster than the engines outside. She didn't know what awaited her on the ground, but deep down she felt the undeniable truth. Her life had just taken a turn she could never undo. First days in paradise. The warm air of Barbados wrapped around Grace like a velvet blanket the moment she stepped off the jet. It was night, but the tropical breeze carried a sweetness she had never known, tinged with salt from the sea and the faint perfume of flowers blooming nearby. The airport was private, quiet, nothing like the chaotic terminal she was used to in Chicago. Instead of rushing crowds, flashing signs, and announcements blaring overhead, there was a soft stillness, broken only by the hum of vehicles waiting to transport the wealthy. Grace clutched the strap of her worn duffel bag as if it were a lifeline, her sneakers sinking slightly into the pavement, the absurdity of her situation pressing harder with every passing moment. She was in a place she had never dreamed of visiting, following a billionaire she barely knew, all because of a single mistake. Ethan moved with effortless confidence, his tall frame leading the way as if the world itself always parted for him. A sleek black SUV was waiting at the bottom of the steps, a driver in a pressed uniform already holding the door open. Without looking back, Ethan gestured for her to follow. For a moment, Grace considered speaking up again, insisting that he book her on the next flight out, but the words stuck in her throat. A part of her told her it was pointless. There were no late-night flights to Chicago, and she had no hotel reservation, no plan, and no idea where she was. For better or worse, she was tied to Ethan for at least the night. The SUV purred to life, gliding smoothly down the quiet roads that wound along the coastline. Grace pressed her forehead lightly against the cool glass of the window, staring at the palm trees outlined by moonlight, the ocean glittering faintly in the distance. She had seen oceans before, but never like this. Back home, Lake Michigan was wide and gray, often harsh and stormy. Here the water looked alive, as if it carried secrets in its shimmering waves. She wanted to hate it, to remind herself that this was not her trip, not her life, but the beauty seeped in despite her resistance. Ethan finally broke the silence. "You're quiet," he said, his voice calm, low, almost casual. "Are you always this cautious, or is it me?" Grace straightened in her seat, startled. I'm just trying to process everything. Yesterday I was running through hospital corridors and now I'm here. It doesn't feel real." He glanced at her, the corner of his mouth lifting in the faintest smile. "Most people would be gushing by now, telling me how lucky they are, how excited they feel. You don't strike me as someone easily impressed." "I'm impressed," she admitted softly, her eyes returning to the window. "But I've learned that being dazzled doesn't pay the bills. You enjoy the moment and then reality comes back." There was something in her tone, resilient, practical, edged with quiet strength, that seemed to catch his attention. For a man who lived in a world where people bent over backwards to flatter him, her honesty was unexpected. He studied her profile for a long moment, then leaned back, resting his arm casually against the door. "You're interesting, Grace Patterson. I can't decide if this accident is an inconvenience or a gift." Her stomach fluttered at his words, though she quickly pushed the feeling down. This was not her world, and she couldn't let herself get swept up in it. Still, she couldn't deny the strange pull she felt toward him, the curiosity that made her want to understand who he was beneath the billion-dollar fortune and the carefully controlled exterior. The SUV finally turned into a long, palm-lined driveway that seemed to stretch endlessly. At the end stood a villa bathed in soft golden light, its architecture both modern and timeless, blending clean lines with open terraces that seemed to breathe with the ocean breeze. Grace's jaw dropped despite herself. It wasn't just a house. It was a sanctuary, the kind of place that looked like it belonged on the glossy cover of a luxury magazine. The driver parked smoothly, and attendants appeared as if from nowhere, opening doors, collecting luggage, offering polite greetings. Grace clutched her duffel bag closer, feeling small in comparison to the grandeur surrounding her. Inside, the villa was even more breathtaking. High ceilings soared above, fans turning lazily, while the walls opened directly to the sea, letting the sound of waves roll in like music. Every detail was perfect. The marble floors, the soft rugs, the elegant furniture positioned to capture the view. Grace stood frozen in the entryway, overwhelmed, while Ethan moved with the same casual ease he had shown since stepping off the plane. He handed his jacket to one of the staff, gave a few quiet instructions, and then turned back to her as if expecting her to follow. "You'll stay in one of the guest suites," he said matter-of-factly, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "Get some rest. Tomorrow I'll decide how to handle your unusual presence here." Grace wanted to argue, to insist that she couldn't simply stay in a stranger's villa as though she belonged there, but the weight of exhaustion settled over her. She hadn't slept properly in days, not with double shifts at the hospital and the rush travel to the airport. Her body ached, her eyes burned, and despite her confusion and unease, the thought of a bed, any bed, was too tempting to resist. She gave a small nod, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." The guest suite was larger than her entire apartment back in Chicago. A king-sized bed covered in crisp white sheets dominated the room, facing wide glass doors that opened to a balcony overlooking the sea. She set her duffel bag down carefully, almost afraid to disturb the perfection of the space, then stepped outside. The night air was warm, the waves glowing faintly under the moonlight, and for a long moment she simply stood there, listening, breathing, trying to anchor herself. She thought of her mother, of the patients she had left behind, of the conference that would now go on without her. She felt guilt, frustration, and an ache she couldn't quite name. But layered over it was something else. Wonder. Life had thrown her into the wrong place, yet somehow it felt like the beginning of something she was meant to experience. She didn't understand it, but she couldn't deny it. Across the villa, Ethan stood on his own balcony, a glass of scotch in his hand, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He had traveled the world, built empires, and surrounded himself with luxury, but rarely did he feel curious about another human being. Grace Patterson was different. She hadn't asked him for anything, hadn't tried to impress him, hadn't even tried to excuse herself beyond the bare facts. She carried herself with quiet strength, and something about that stirred a part of him he had long buried. He took a slow sip, his eyes narrowing slightly as the waves crashed below. For the first time in years, he felt like the script of his carefully controlled life had been interrupted, and he wasn't sure whether to resist it or lean into it. That night, Grace fell asleep to the sound of the sea, unaware that her life had just shifted onto a path she could never return from. Tomorrow would bring questions, decisions, and moments that would test her in ways she had never imagined. But for now, in the heart of a Caribbean paradise she never meant to reach, she allowed herself to rest. Tides of two worlds. When the morning sun spilled through the wide balcony doors, Grace stirred beneath the soft sheets, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar scent of salt and jasmine in the air. For a brief instant she forgot where she was, expecting to see the cracked ceiling of her Chicago apartment or hear the distant buzz of hospital alarms. Instead, her eyes opened to the dazzling expanse of turquoise sea stretching endlessly beyond the glass. Waves rolled against the shore with a rhythm that seemed to speak directly to her weary soul. She sat up slowly, pressing her hands against the sheets as though trying to ground herself. This wasn't her life, wasn't her trip, and yet here she was, waking up in a billionaire's villa overlooking paradise. The guilt rushed back before she could take her first sip of the island air. She should have been in New York by now, listening to medical professionals discuss resilience in crisis, delivering the small speech she had prepared in between her overnight shifts. She had rehearsed it a dozen times in her tiny kitchen, hoping her voice wouldn't crack with nerves. That opportunity was gone, lost to a simple mix-up that had dropped her into a life she had no claim to. Her heart ached at the thought, but she pushed herself out of bed anyway. Life didn't stop for disappointment. She had learned that long ago. After a quick shower, she slipped back into her jeans and simple blouse, feeling oddly self-conscious as she walked through the villa's polished halls. Everything around her screamed elegance. Polished wood, curated art, fresh flowers in vases that probably cost more than her entire year's rent. The scent of brewed coffee and warm pastries guided her to a wide veranda where a long table was, set with breakfast. Ethan sat at the far end, crisp in a white shirt, sleeves rolled casually to his elbows, his gaze scanning the screen of his phone. He looked every bit the powerful figure she had seen on television, yet there was something quieter about him here, away from cameras and boardrooms. He glanced up as she approached. "Good morning, Nurse Patterson," he said smoothly, his tone carrying the faintest trace of amusement. "Sleep well?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Better than I have in a long time. Thank you, and for letting me stay." He gestured to the chair opposite him. "Sit, eat. You'll need your strength today. I have meetings, but I don't want you wandering off unaccompanied. Consider yourself my responsibility, at least until we decide what to do about your situation." The phrasing pricked at her pride, as though she were some misplaced package he had to manage. Still she sat, her hunger winning against her discomfort. The fruit was sweeter than anything she'd ever tasted, the bread soft, the coffee rich. She ate cautiously, aware of his eyes on her, though he never paused in his quiet conversation with an assistant over the phone. When he finally hung up, he leaned back, studying her with an intensity that made her shift in her seat. "Tell me something, Grace. Why did you become a nurse? With your intelligence, you could have chosen something more lucrative." The question caught her off guard. She set her fork down, brushing her hands against her napkin. "Because when my father died, the nurse who stayed with us through the worst of it was the only one who made me believe we'd survive. I wanted to be that for someone else." Her voice wavered slightly, but she held his gaze. It was never about money, it was about meaning. Ethan's expression softened, almost imperceptibly. For a man who lived in a world built on profit, acquisitions and negotiations, her answer seemed to strike a chord he didn't expect. He looked away, his jaw tightening as if caught in a thought he preferred not to voice. After breakfast, he suggested they walk the grounds, and though she wanted to protest, remind him that she wasn't here as a guest but by mistake, she followed. The villa opened to sprawling gardens alive with color, pathways lined with bougainvillea, and pools of water so clear they reflected the sky. Beyond it all stretched the beach, golden sand curving gently as if drawn by a careful hand. Grace hesitated at the edge of the terrace, the sand gleaming like an invitation. "You've never been here before, have you?" Ethan asked, watching her with a faint smile. She shook her head. "I've never been anywhere like this. The closest I've come to a vacation is eating takeout by the lake on my day off." The honesty slipped out before she could stop it, and for a moment she wished she could take it back, but instead of pity, she saw something like respect flicker in his eyes. "Then consider today your first real break. No hospitals, no alarms, no responsibilities. Just the sea." They walked down the steps and onto the sand, the warmth sinking into her shoes, then her bare feet as she slipped them off. The ocean stretched before her, alive and restless, and as she stepped closer, the waves curled over her toes, cool and exhilarating. For the first time in years, she felt herself laugh, a soft, surprised sound that escaped before she could control it. Ethan watched her, something shifting in his expression. He was used to women who already lived in luxury, who saw beaches like these as another backdrop for their curated lives. But Grace's wonder was genuine, unpolished, free. It stirred something in him he hadn't felt in a long time, a reminder that the world was meant to be lived in, not just owned. They walked along the shoreline, talking in fits and starts. She told him about her patience, about the small joys she found in moments of gratitude, about how she measured her life not in money, but in the lives she touched. He told her little, though she caught glimpses, stories of deals made and empires built, but also hints of loneliness in the pauses between his words. As the sun climbed higher, casting gold across the water, Grace realized something unsettling. The more time she spent in Ethan's world, the harder it became to remind herself that she didn't belong here. She had boarded the wrong jet, stepped into the wrong life, but each passing hour drew her deeper into a reality she could not have imagined for herself. It was dangerous, she knew, to let her heart wander where it had no right to go. Yet as the waves lapped at her ankles and Ethan's quiet presence anchored her steps, she couldn't help but feel that fate had placed her here for a reason she did not yet understand. Walls began to crack. The second day in Barbados unfolded beneath a flawless sky, the kind of blue that seemed almost unreal, as though painted by an artist who had never known sorrow. Grace awoke to the rhythmic crash of waves against the shore, her body heavy from the comfort of rest she had not felt in years. Yet even as the island worked its magic on her weary spirit, unease lingered like a shadow. This was still not her life. The bed was not hers, the view was not hers, and the man waiting in the villa's dining hall was certainly not part of her world. She was still the nurse who had boarded the wrong flight, caught in a story that did not belong to her. When she joined Ethan for breakfast, the tension was different from the day before. He was already seated at the table, his posture straight, his shirt pressed, his expression unreadable as he scrolled through messages on his phone. Grace noticed the faint lines of fatigue around his eyes, though he masked them well. She poured herself coffee quietly, choosing a seat further down the table as though the physical space might protect her from the weight of his presence. "You're distant this morning," he observed, without looking up, his voice calm but edged with curiosity. She hesitated before answering. "I'm trying not to forget who I am. Yesterday felt dangerous. For a few hours I let myself believe I belonged here. But I don't." That drew his eyes upward. His gaze locked onto hers, sharp and piercing as though daring her to explain. "Why not?" "Because I'm not the kind of person who wakes up in a villa on the ocean. I'm a nurse who works double shifts to cover her bills. I'm someone who saves every penny for emergencies. People like me don't take spontaneous trips to Barbados, and we don't share breakfast with billionaires." Her honesty hung in the air between them, heavier than the humid breeze that drifted in from the sea. For a long moment Ethan said nothing, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of his coffee cup. Then, almost unexpectedly, he leaned back and let out a short laugh, not cruel, but sharp with recognition. "You think you're the only one living in the wrong world?" he asked quietly. His voice carried a weight she had not heard before, a vulnerability tucked beneath his usual confidence. "Do you know what it's like to have everything and still feel as though you have nothing real? To build empires only to come home to silence? People assume money solves everything, but money cannot buy belonging. It cannot erase loneliness, and it certainly cannot heal the scars no one sees." Grace's breath caught at the rawness in his tone. For the first time, the walls around him cracked, and she saw not the untouchable billionaire, but a man carrying burdens no one else bothered to imagine. She leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but steady. "So what do you do with all that emptiness?" He looked away, his jaw tightening. The answer caught somewhere between confession and denial. "You learn to live with it, or you bury it, under work, distractions, and people who want you for what you can give, not who you are." The silence that followed was thick, but not uncomfortable. Grace studied him, her heart shifting in ways she didn't expect. She had seen suffering countless times in the hospital, bodies failing, lives unraveling, but the kind of pain Ethan carried was different. It was hidden, invisible, the kind that wealth disguised but never erased. Their fragile connection, however, was soon tested. Later that afternoon, Ethan invited her to accompany him to a private luncheon with business associates at a resort on the other side of the island. Grace refused at first, insisting she didn't belong there, but he was persistent. "You'll be fine," he said with quiet authority. "You don't need to play a role, just be yourself." She reluctantly agreed, though anxiety knotted in her stomach as the car pulled up to the glittering resort. The gathering was small but extravagant, filled with men and women dressed in designer clothes, their conversations peppered with terms she barely understood. Deals worth millions were discussed over glasses of champagne as casually as she and her colleagues discussed patient charts. Grace sat at Ethan's side, painfully aware of her simple dress and the way curious eyes flicked toward her, questioning who she was and why she was there. When one of the men leaned forward, his smile sharp, and asked, "So, Ms. Patterson, what do you do for Ethan?" She felt her throat tighten. Ethan opened his mouth to answer, but Grace cut in, her voice firm despite her nerves. "I'm not part of his business. I'm a nurse from Chicago. I'm here by accident. The table went silent for a beat before laughter rippled around, dismissive and amused. One of the women smirked. How quaint. The word dripped with condescension, as though Grace were an entertaining story rather than a person. Grace flushed, her chest burning with embarrassment. She pushed her chair back slightly, ready to leave, but Ethan's hand rested lightly against hers beneath the table, stopping her. His eyes, when she met them, were dark with something fierce. That's enough, he said sharply to the others, his tone commanding immediate silence. The weight of authority in his voice cut through the mocking like a blade. He turned his gaze back to Grace, softer now, and gave the smallest nod as though telling her she had nothing to prove. The rest of the luncheon passed in a blur, but the damage lingered. On the drive back to the villa, Grace sat pressed against the door, staring out at the sea while anger and humiliation twisted inside her. You shouldn't have brought me there, she said finally, her voice low but tight. I didn't belong and everyone knew it. I'm not a prop you can place beside you for convenience. Ethan's jaw tightened as he gripped the wheel. That wasn't my intention. I thought you could handle it. You seem stronger than most people I know. Her chest rose and fell, the conflict raw in her voice. Being strong doesn't mean I enjoy being mocked. I didn't ask to be here, Ethan. I didn't choose this life. Don't forget that. The words stung him more than she realized. For a man used to control, used to being admired, her rejection cut deeper than the dismissal of any business rival. He said nothing more, and the rest of the ride was heavy with silence. Back at the villa, Grace retreated to her suite, tears burning in her eyes as she closed the balcony doors behind her. She hated the way the laughter of strangers still echoed. In her ears, hated the way she had let their words pierce her. But beneath the anger there was something else, a flicker of guilt. Because despite the humiliation, despite the conflict, she couldn't deny that a part of her wanted to be seen by Ethan. Not as an accident, not as a mistake, but as someone who belonged by his side. And as Ethan sat alone in the great hall, staring into the amber swirl of his untouched drink, he felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest, a fear that for the first time in years, he might lose something before he ever had the chance to claim it. Beneath the surface, the tension between Grace and Ethan lingered into the following morning like a heavy fog. Neither of them could quite clear. Breakfast was quieter, the air charged with the memory of their conflict from the day before. Grace kept her eyes on her plate, pushing fruit around without appetite, while Ethan sat across from her with his jaw tight, his attention fixed on his phone, though she knew he wasn't reading the words. They were both retreating into silence, and yet silence had a way of saying more than words ever could. After breakfast, Grace retreated to the beach alone, carrying only a towel and a book she had brought from home, though she hardly read it. She sat near the shoreline, letting the waves lap at her feet, her eyes drifting between the pages and the horizon. The Caribbean sun warmed her skin, but inside she felt restless. She should have been back in Chicago by now, tending to patients, sharing coffee with her colleagues, listening to Mrs. Henderson complain about her pain meds or calming a child frightened by IV tubes. Instead, she was here, wrapped in a paradise she hadn't asked for, her heart pulling in directions she didn't trust. It was nearly an hour before Ethan appeared, dressed simply in a white shirt and light trousers, his bare feet sinking into the sand as he walked toward her. Grace stiffened, unsure if she was ready for another clash, but his expression was different today. There was no arrogance, no mask of indifference, just a quiet determination that softened the sharp lines of his face. He stopped a few feet away, his voice carrying low above the sound of the surf. I owe you an apology, he said. Grace blinked, caught off guard. For what? For yesterday. For putting you in a situation you didn't deserve, and for assuming you could be placed into my world as easily as I place a piece on a chessboard. You were right. I forgot this isn't your life. That was unfair of me. The sincerity in his tone disarmed her, loosening the defenses she had built overnight. She searched his face, looking for the smirk, the hint of control, but it wasn't there. Instead, she saw a man stripped of the armor he usually wore, a man who was trying, however awkwardly, to bridge the space between them. "Thank you," she said softly, setting the book aside. "I didn't mean to be harsh yesterday. I don't like feeling small. And that's exactly what I felt sitting at that table." Ethan nodded slowly. "I understand. Believe me, I know what it feels like to be diminished, even when the world thinks you hold all the power. People assume money shields you from judgment, but often it amplifies it. They see what they want to see, not who you are." His words surprised her, not because of their truth, but because of how closely they mirrored her own feelings. For a moment they sat in silence, the ocean washing over the distance between them. Then Ethan lowered himself onto the sand beside her, close, enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, but not so close that it felt invasive. It was the first time he had chosen to step into her space rather than ask her to step into his. The hours that followed unfolded with unexpected ease. They walked along the shoreline, sometimes talking, sometimes letting silence carry them. Grace spoke of her childhood in Chicago, of her mother's endless sacrifices, of how she had learned to find joy in the smallest things because luxuries were rare. Ethan listened intently, asking questions, his usual sharpness softened by genuine curiosity. In turn, he spoke of his childhood in fragments, revealing a lonely boy raised by nannies and tutors, whose parents were too busy building fortunes to notice the sun in front of them. It was a portrait of privilege painted in shades of neglect, and Grace felt her heart ache for the child he had once been. Later in the afternoon, Ethan suggested they take a boat out along the coast, and though Grace hesitated at first, she agreed. The small yacht shimmered in the sunlight, gliding smoothly over the turquoise waves. Grace stood at the bow, the wind tugging at her hair, the spray of the sea cool against her skin. For the first time since arriving, she let herself laugh freely, the sound carried away by the wind. Ethan watched her from the deck, his chest tightening at the sight. He had seen countless beautiful women in his life, but none had captivated him the way Grace did when she allowed herself to be unguarded, free, alive. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, the conversation deepened. Grace turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if you weren't born into wealth?" Ethan was quiet for a long time before answering. "Every day. Sometimes I think money has been both my greatest gift and my greatest curse. It built walls around me, walls that keep people out but also keep me trapped. I envy people like you, Grace. You fight for meaning every day. You know exactly why you wake up in the morning. I can't say the same." His confession struck her, like a tide, sweeping away the distance between them. She had thought of him as untouchable, a man who never questioned his place in the world, but now she saw him differently, a man burdened by wealth, suffocating beneath the very empire he had inherited and expanded. As the boat rocked gently with the waves, a quiet moment settled between them, heavy with unspoken things. Grace felt her heart quicken, not just from the beauty of the evening, but from the awareness of how close they were, how his gaze lingered on her with something deeper than curiosity. For a fleeting second, she wondered if the pull she felt toward him was written in the stars or born of the strange accident that had brought them together. When they returned to the villa, the night air was thick with the scent of jasmine, the waves crashing against the shore like a steady heartbeat. Grace retreated to her suite, standing on the balcony with the moonlight spilling across her face. She should have been afraid of what was happening, afraid of how quickly her heart was opening in a world she did not belong to. Yet instead of fear, she felt a calm certainty, as though some part of her had been waiting all her life for this impossible turn of fate. Ethan, alone in his own room, stood by the window with a glass in his hand, staring out at the same horizon. For years he had filled his life with noise, deals, acquisitions, constant motion. Yet here, with a woman who had walked into his life by mistake, he found silence that was not empty, but full. He did not know where it would lead, but for the first time he wanted to find out. Choices of the heart. The final morning in Barbados dawned with a brilliance that seemed almost cruel in its beauty. The sea shimmered under the rising sun, and the breeze carried the sweetness of hibiscus blossoms across the villa grounds. Grace stood on her balcony watching the horizon, her heart heavy despite the paradise before her. 3 days ago, she had been a nurse scrambling through hospital corridors, her life measured in 12-hour shifts and moments of stolen rest. Now she had lived in a world she had never imagined: private jets, villas on the sea, and the company of a man who had unsettled and awakened her in equal measure. She knew that soon this chapter would close. The question was whether it would fade into memory as an impossible accident or mark the beginning of something far greater than either of them could have planned. Ethan found her at breakfast, dressed more casually than usual, his crisp white shirt open at the collar, his demeanor quiet and thoughtful. He didn't scroll through his phone, didn't call for staff, didn't surround himself with distractions. Instead, he simply sat across from her, his blue eyes fixed on hers as though searching for something he couldn't name. "Tomorrow I fly back," he said at last, his voice carrying both certainty and hesitation. "There are meetings, deals, responsibilities I cannot delay. But before I leave, we need to talk about what this has been." Grace's chest tightened. She had known this conversation was inevitable, yet hearing it aloud made it real. She set her fork down slowly, her hands folding in her lap to steady herself. "This has been a mistake," she said softly, though even as the words left her lips they tasted like a lie. "I wasn't supposed to be here. You weren't supposed to know me. When I go home, I'll be a nurse again, and you'll be a billionaire. That's the truth." Ethan leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "Is that what you want? To walk away as though this never happened? Because I cannot pretend it was meaningless. You think you're the one out of place here, Grace, but the truth is you've made me see myself more clearly than anyone has in years. I've lived surrounded by everything, yet I felt nothing. Until you." Her breath caught at the raw honesty in his words. She had wanted to believe this was one-sided, that her feelings were a fleeting illusion born of paradise and proximity, but now she knew it wasn't just her. He felt it too, the pull, the shift, the undeniable bond forged by chance. And that frightened her more than anything. They spent the day together, as though both knew it might be their last. They walked the narrow streets of Bridgetown, where vendors sold fruit and handmade jewelry, where children laughed and chased one another in the sun. Grace felt more alive in those moments than she had in years, tasting spices she had never known, listening to music that vibrated through her bones, watching Ethan smile in ways she had never seen back in the villa. Here, away from the boardroom and the walls of wealth, he seemed lighter, freer, almost ordinary. She realized then that beneath his billions and his power, he was simply a man searching for belonging, just as she was. That evening, as the sun sank low and painted the sea in hues of crimson and gold, Ethan led her down to the beach. The waves rolled gently at their feet, the sand cool beneath their steps. He stopped, turning to face her fully, the fading light softening his features. "Grace," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the storm she saw in his eyes. "I know you didn't choose this, but I can't deny what I feel. When I return to New York, my life will pull me in 100 directions, but none of it will matter if you're not in it. Come with me. Not as an assistant, not as someone out of place, but as yourself. I don't care about the differences in our worlds. I care about you." The words crashed over her like a wave, both terrifying and exhilarating. She stared at him, her heart racing, torn between reason and desire. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "my life is in Chicago. My patients, my mother, everything I've built, it's there. I can't just abandon it. And what if this is only magic because we're here, because it's paradise? What if it doesn't survive the real world?" He stepped closer, his hand brushing gently against hers, grounding her. "Then let's find out. I don't want to wonder what might have been. I'd rather fight for something real than spend the rest of my life surrounded by people who only see my money. You see me, Grace. That's worth everything." Tears welled in her eyes, spilling before she could stop them. She had spent years giving everything to others, pouring her heart into her patients, her family, her responsibilities, never once allowing herself to imagine she could be chosen, wanted, cherished. And now, here was this man, flawed and lonely in ways she understood, too well asking her to believe that love was possible even in the most unlikely of places. She didn't answer with words. Instead, she stepped into his arms, letting the waves crash around them as she pressed her forehead against his chest. His arms closed around her tightly, not as a man claiming possession, but as someone holding on to the one thing he couldn't bear to lose. In that moment, all the barriers between their worlds seemed to dissolve, leaving only the truth of what they had found. The next morning, when the jet lifted off from the island, Grace sat beside Ethan, her hand in his, the horizon stretching wide ahead. She didn't know what challenges awaited them, didn't know how her life in Chicago would reconcile with his in New York, but for the first time in years, she felt something she had thought she lost forever: hope. And as the clouds parted and the sun lit the sky, she knew that whatever came next, she was no longer walking alone.